This week, millions of students across Canada will be going back to school, and education in our education system will be top of mind to millions of parents and educators. Now, there's no doubt the pandemic has had a profound impact on children. It has put many of their parents out of work, surrounded their homes in grief and anxiety, and kept many of them out of schools that teach and care for them. It has been a very lonely time for Canadian children. With 2 weeks left to go in the federal election campaign, I wonder, why haven't we heard more about education on the campaign trail? Welcome back to inFocus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode of inFocus, I'm joined by Sam Hammond, the president of the Canadian Teachers Federation. Sam just started his 2-year term as CTF president in July 2021. Prior, Sam was president of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. He has taught all grades from junior kindergarten to grade 8 and was an instructor in the labor studies program at McMaster University. The Canadian Teachers Federation represents over 300,000 elementary and secondary school teachers across Canada. Sam and I spoke about the role of public education in federal politics, some polling Abacus did for the CTF, and what he's hoping to hear from federal parties and candidates in the final weeks of the campaign. I hope you enjoy my chat with Sam Hammond. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Congrats on your election to president of the Canadian Teachers Federation a few months ago. And I, as we said, just as we came on here, you're physically on the job 2 weeks in, so thrown right into the gauntlet of a national federal election. So welcome. Thank you for joining.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite, and I look forward to the conversation.
So before we get into the campaign and then the election, I think it's prudent of us to start by better understanding, as kids start to go back to school almost universally now across the country today, the impact the pandemic has had on public education in Canada. Can you give me a sense of what the past 17 months have been like for students, for teachers, for the whole system?
Yeah, so, if you go back 17, 18 months, as you've suggested, middle of March 2020, within 48 hours, our world changed, quite frankly, in terms of how we interact and limitations that were put on our socialization, where we could go, what we could do, etc. And that was absolutely evident in education as schools were shut down overnight across this country. And it has been a challenging, chaotic year for teachers, for educators, for principals, for families, and for students, absolutely over the course of that 18 months. And, one of the things that has happened, that has been made clear, are all of the gaps in publicly funded education, funding for resources for where there were Band-Aid solutions put onto those. And this pandemic has torn those Band-Aids off or exposed those gaps across the country. Educators have struggled. Whether they have been in a classroom and then out of a classroom. I think in Ontario, 3 or 4 times in and out, schools open and close, as well as students. And there is no doubt that this pandemic has certainly, torn away at the resilience of educators, of students and families in this country.
As students go back, what's the outlook today? Is there optimism that in person is going to be permanent forward, or is there a sense that this fourth wave might push us back into some of that back and forth mess that students and educators experienced before, as you said?
all of us, educators across this country want to be in classrooms with students. That's where the best learning takes place. That's the best environment, that one-on-one, up-close interacting with students on a regular basis. And across this country, as professionals, teachers and education staff are ready to do that. But I would suggest to you that there's probably as much, if not more, concern this year going back to school as opposed to a year ago. For example, if you look at the counts across the country, this time 2020, heading into Labor Day weekend, the numbers were 50, 80, 120, whatever across the country, and certainly in some territories, no cases. But you look at what's happening now at BC, there's over 600 cases. Alberta, yesterday, I think 1,200 cases. Ontario, 850 cases with this new Delta variant. And you combine that with what so many are suggesting across the country, the lack of real detailed, comprehensive, integrated safety protocols. It's concerning, extremely concerning. And I've said on a couple of occasions that without the funding, the much needed funding, the much needed resources, and the detailed safety protocols, I think we may see very soon into the school year higher case counts, particularly with children and those under 12. And that is concerning. And I, for the life of me, can't understand why provincial territorial governments aren't saying whatever it costs, whatever time it takes, we need to invest and ensure the safety of absolutely everyone. And if you need to peel back layers as we go on, then so be it.
And it's this is a politics and public opinion podcast. We're in the middle of a federal election. I can't recall any of the federal party leaders or the parties talking about education. I know we'll talk about this. I know it's not a federal responsibility, but they're talking a lot about healthcare, and that's not federal responsibility. So today on Tuesday, the CTF, the Canadian Teachers Federation, is launching a national campaign to raise awareness about education. And it's calling on policymakers, federal parties, educators, parents, everyone who cares about education, public education in the country, to start a national conversation about it. Can you tell me more about this campaign and why the Federation is launching this campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. We're launching this federal campaign because we want to have a national conversation about publicly funded public education in this country that we know from the data polling that we've gotten is high in terms of priorities for people across this country. Just as you said, the federal government and federal leaders of each of the parties talk about national pharmacare. They talk about national childcare, national health care. It is time for them to start talking about taking seriously and investing in national funding and priorities for education across this country. Yes, it's a provincial and territorial priority, but the federal government, for example, if you look at this pandemic and had the federal government come out and put in masking policies across the country, if they had done some of the things now or would do now or talk about in this election, some of the things that the Canadian Medical Association is talking about, smaller class sizes, mandatory vaccinations, vaccination passports on a federal level, I think we'd be in a much better place. And we want publicly funded public education in this country to be accessible to all, in a very equitable way in every corner of the country from coast to coast to coast.
So let me dig there on the problem a little bit, right? Like, why do we need a national conversation? I think you alluded to it and I wouldn't be surprised that access to high quality public education is not the same in all parts of the country, right? I think, again, using the parallel with healthcare, like the Canada Health Act's main purpose was to raise guidelines, standards, conditions so that, which is still not perfectly delivered on, that a Canadian living in any part of this country has a basic level of access to public health care. But we don't have the equivalent in Canada. So maybe you could speak to some of like what is the range of experience that a student and family living in one part of the country might experience that's different than somebody in another part.
Yeah, so you've touched on a few important things, and when we look at our poll, that Abacus Data poll that we got, and 95% of Canadians believe it's important that all children and youth have equal access to high quality, publicly funded public education. National guidelines can only help that. A national conversation about the issues can only help that, highlight those issues, and allow us to deal with them in provinces and territories across this country. We've called, for example, for a national table, a national task force on publicly funded public education in this country, long overdue, to get experts at that table from all of the different provinces and territories, all levels of education, along with politicians and policymakers and healthcare professionals, to be able to look at education on a national level. I just talked this morning with a reporter in Nunavut, and she was talking about the online learning realities there, or this terrible hybrid model of teaching in class and video conferencing with students doesn't exist there. And the reason it doesn't in many parts of Ontario in the north and other provinces, Alberta, BC, is the lack of Wi-Fi, the lack of connectivity in each of those areas. When you look at the socioeconomic gaps and concerns across this country, when you look at First Nation, Métis, and Inuit education in terms of what's lacking there and how each of those areas could benefit from a national conversation, national policy, we think it would be prudent for government and policymakers, and not just the government, but all of those parties, the parties right now and their leaders. It should be a priority for each of them.
And yet you don't hear very much at all, if anything. Maybe candidates at the door will start hearing more now that parents and grandparents are hearing stories and thinking again about their kids and grandkids being back in school.
Yeah, and a very high percentage of Canadians, well over 80%, agree that education, publicly funded education, is the cornerstone of this country, of our democracy and our way of life and society. So, similar to healthcare, we should be, everyone in this country, and most importantly, the leadership in the federal government in each of the provinces and territory, should be making education a priority. It's just always baffled me why that doesn't happen.
It also seems to me that, I've read studies and other analysis of the impact the pandemic has had on children, right? Both because they have been in and out of school and their support networks have been reduced, and their ability to just socialize with friends and family I don't know if they use this term, but this is what comes to mind, is we almost need a Marshall Plan to help kids get caught back up. Like, they've lost 2 years of their lives, key parts of their sort of socialization and upbringing, it does seem to me that now more than ever, Canadians, and you're right, the polling we did shows that it would not be politically risky to have our national leaders talk about what they think they can do to coordinate and lead to rebuild, the education system. And not to say it's in a sad state everywhere, but that I think people across the country recognize the challenge that, as you said, educators, students, parents have faced the past year and a half, that it would be like almost a no-brainer, right? That we should be doing more as a country, not just as a province, but as a country to put this, to make this right again.
No, absolutely. I'm not sure if I agree with a Marshall Plan, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from and agree on the intent. But yes, it should be a priority. Let me give you just two examples of why, if we really as a nation care about publicly funded public education. I talked about the gaps earlier that were exposed by the pandemic, and a big part of those gaps were the lack of resources, the lack of funding, let's say. And what's happened in many provinces is it has become an opportune time for provincial governments, some, to use the opportunity to try to privatize parts of publicly funded education. If you look at what's happening in Ontario, for example, with a push for online synchronous learning and trying to set all of that up through and take it out of the education framework is absolutely concerning. That should be a concern for every politician, every parent and educator. It is, I know, in this country. And the other issue that you touched on is mental health issues. For good quality, high standard education and teaching to happen, there's two parts to that, right? And that is the well-being of the educators, teachers, as well as those students. And that there have not been, from what we've heard, what I've seen, the supports and the resources there for both educators and students. And that needs to happen, because if you want to have quality education, and we have one of the best education systems in the world, don't get me wrong, across the board. But if you want to maintain that and you want to continue to improve and you want the absolute best experience for both those educators and students, you need to invest in healthcare supports, and you need to stay away from and move away from and say no to and stop the privatization of publicly funded public education.
I want to come back to privatization in a moment, but the link between the quality of our public education system and our long-term economic competitiveness is absolutely clear in people's minds. Our polling showed that, right? Almost all. You can't almost get close to a consensus that says
absolutely
we cannot be competitive as a country in the future if we don't have a strong public education system. So again, the public sees the link, and it's not partisan. There's no differences regionally. There's as close a consensus as you can get. But I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about, so I'm almost 40, and when I was going in high school and then going into post-secondary, a lot of my friends or peers around me, you heard a lot of them saying, I want to be a teacher, right? And there was a point, even in my early career, where you heard of, too many students coming out with an education degree and not enough positions. But more and more in the last few years, I've heard the opposite, right? That there is a teacher shortage, that school boards are having a hard time finding teachers. Can you speak to me about that as a real problem for public education that the pandemic has, I assume, only made worse, in the same way that we've seen nurses saying, I'm done, this has been too stressful. I know I do some work with a public sector teachers union in Ontario, and they're seeing the same thing, that the level of anxiety and stress is just causing many to say, I can't deal with it. Is there an impending teacher shortage, and like what are some of the solutions, and is there a role for a federal conversation in that?
Yes, and yes. Probably last year, say leading into June 2020, I would say that there were areas in the country where retirement rates spiked a bit, went up. And I would suggest that that's in part due to all of those challenges, the chaos and the stresses and the lack of resources that were exposed because of the pandemic and the demands put on teachers. If I use Ontario, for example, I'm sure it happened elsewhere. Teachers were in classrooms one day and the next or 2 days later, they're online teaching without any support, without any resources. Absolutely. I fully understand. This is one of the greatest professions in the world in terms of teaching, creating, inquisitive, creative minds, and helping to build a very positive, dynamic democracy and society in the future in terms of the role that teachers and educators play. But I can certainly understand why students who are in faculties of education across this country or thinking about entering may take a second look and say, given everything that's happening, given the lack of supports, given what I'm watching educators going through, why would I want to be a part of that when I can go off and in the first 5 years of my career do something else, maybe makes more money, and that's all of the get the economic benefits from that. You don't hear that from teachers. You hear teachers who are in the profession concerned about the challenges, the demands, the long hours. But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of it, once they're in it, absolutely love it and see the benefits to it. And it's sad. Quite frankly, it's sad to know that what's happening now is in fact having an effect on students and young adults who are looking at this, or we're looking at this as a profession. And we need to do something about that, not just on a provincial territorial basis, but a federal basis.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, recently the current federal government said, looking at debt, and one of the parties is going to eliminate that debt. I think the NDP and those sorts of things. We should be going. That's good, all great stuff. The current government made investments in mental health issues. I think $100 million for frontline workers. We hope teachers are a part of that, but there's so much more to do that could be done on a federal level.
Well, you raise a good point. Even I think the Liberal Party in its platform, or prior to its release of its platform, promised to help close the shortage in nurses. Right, federal government getting involved in provincial jurisdiction. Right, here's more evidence that it does happen. So, bringing this back then to the election, why do you think we haven't heard? I know you're trying to spark that conversation, which is what this campaign's about, but why aren't federal parties talking about this right now? And if they did start, what are you hoping to hear from the leaders over the next 2 weeks as this campaign, gets closer to the end here?
I think in part why we're not hearing from them like we would like to. Is because it's not a federal issue. It's a delicate balance in terms of working with provinces and territories across the country. I think that's the first part. But as you've suggested and I've commented on, it should be a priority, and we need to figure out that balance, and we need to figure out how we can move beyond that. So, some of the things that we wish that they were talking about now, and we are absolutely, over the next couple of weeks going to be pushing for, is a national conversation on publicly funded public education. We want to see more funding for mental health issues that are directed to the teaching profession and to students in terms of on an ongoing basis. We want to see a commitment to the strengthening of publicly funded education. We would love to hear the leaders of each party, maybe a bit too late for their platforms, but to hear them actually make a commitment to public education and speak against and point out all of the drawbacks and the negative side of the privatization and or commercialization of public education in this country. We want to see a strong commitment to truth and reconciliation in this country, and they can set a federal standard in terms of curriculum and talking about authentic histories and the truths of our Indigenous peoples in this country, and working with provinces to make sure that happens. So we also would hope at this time, given the pandemic and the start of the school year, that there be more focus on the safety of educators and students across this country, and talking about the lack of safety protocols, given what's happening across the country in a number of provinces and territories.
And I think, again, I've done lots of polling on these kinds of questions, not just for, the Federation, but other clients and just on my own. And everyone always comes back to me and says, well, if this is provincial jurisdiction and the federal leaders are not going to touch it because Quebec will not accept. And perhaps the political leaders in Quebec are extra sensitive to the federal government getting involved. When you ask Quebecers on issues around healthcare, on education, on childcare, they are open to the federal government helping their province improve their systems, right? At the end of the day, I really believe that people don't care how the problem gets solved, as long as the problem gets solved. And for whatever reason, and I think we're starting to see the change in that, because the conversation in healthcare, at least in this first part of the campaign, shows that the leaders are willing to talk about this if the public cares, if they believe the public cares. Our polling shows education, especially now that that's going to be in focus over the next 2 weeks, they care about it. And so we'll see. I think it's a great, the Federation's the only one, I think, raising this flag and saying, now's the time we talk about this. And I really wish you the best of luck, because I'm going to put my a little bit of bias into my view here, but I for one also believe that public education and a good public education is critical. And I'm an education voter, even though I don't have kids. I know I want my nephews and my nieces to have that for themselves. So, Sam, it's been a real pleasure to meet you and talk with you about this and work with your team on the polling. And maybe we'll connect again, and hopefully a few months from now that conversation has started, and we'll see how whatever government we get at the end of this election puts education on its agenda. So thanks so much.
No, David, thank you for the time to actually have a conversation, if you will, about publicly funded public education in this province. And if I may, I just want to comment on, you talk about Quebec, and I absolutely agree with you in terms of Quebecers are as concerned about education, the quality of education in their province as others are. For example, in British Columbia, or in the Northwest Territories, absolutely. And the numbers support that. And it's time for us to push on policymakers and get the attention of people and to do what we can to ensure that we have a strong, equitable, inclusive education system in this country for decades to come.
Well, thanks so much, and have a good rest of the campaign.
Yeah, thanks so much.